Let's call the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. My name is Judge Melissa Watt. Scoring judges, please look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means that the only people on the screen right now should be me and the advocates. Can the attorneys please make the appearances?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Dan Peale. I'm assisted here by James Orr.
Good afternoon.
And together we represent the United States in today's case.
Vince?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Julia Greve, and along with my second chair, Mr. Kevin Johnson, we represent the defense. Kara Bassett.
Okay. Are there any pretrial matters before we get started?
First, Your Honor, we'd like to invoke Federal Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses except for the defendant.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay.
And next, Your Honor, we'd like to draw the court's attention to a pretrial order in this case, specifically number 7, which says that exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted and can be used at any time.
That is our understanding as well.
Okay.
With that, government's ready to go.
Vince?
Your Honor, given the format of this trial, we would like to screen share exhibits for authentication purposes before they're entered into evidence. We just ask that all exhibits be kept constructively outside the view of the jury until they have been admitted.
Sure, that's my understanding as well.
And with that, we're ready to go.
Okay, we will now hear the opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right-hand corner. And attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking.
May we open?
Go ahead.
The drug, the dirt, and the DNA. Members of the jury, this is a murder case. The victim is a 38-year-old man named Don Clark. He died in August of 2017 when he was drugged, dumped into a swamp, and left for dead. And today we'll prove the person who killed him was his wife, the defendant, Kara Bassett. Because today you'll hear that although the defendant and the victim were married, they weren't close. You'll learn that Mr. Clark was worth almost $8 million, but the defendant wasn't. You'll hear that Mr. Clark went missing, but the defendant waited a full week to report that to anyone. And you'll learn why that was. Because she killed him, covered it up, and tried to get away with all of his money. But today we'll prove that the defendant got caught because the FBI found 3 critical pieces of evidence. Today you're going to learn that they searched her house and found the drug that she used to kill her husband. You'll hear they found dirt on her shoes that came from the swamp where she dumped the body. And you'll learn how they found Mr. Clark's DNA in the van that the defendant used to pull it off. The drug, the dirt, and the DNA. But of course, as the government, we can't just tell you that's what happened. We've got to prove it. And because we've charged the defendant with murder, we have to prove that she killed her husband and that she did it on purpose, beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to do that by asking you to focus on those pieces of evidence. And let's start with that first one, the drug. Because today you're going to learn that the defendant and Mr. Clark owned an elephant sanctuary together, which meant they had a pretty large stockpile of a pretty strong tranquilizing drug. Strong enough to sedate an elephant, but kill a human. And you'll hear how some of that drug was missing. And when the FBI asked the defendant about it, all she said was, "I don't know where it is." Which will bring us to that second fact, the dirt. Because you're going to hear today that the FBI found a unique kind of dirt on the defendant's shoes. You'll learn how they analyzed that forensically and found that it matched the dirt found both inside of the van and at a swamp 100 miles away. Which brings us to that third thing, the DNA. Because you're going to hear how the FBI found Mr. Clark's DNA inside of a van that had been abandoned at the local airport, and that they found that van a week after Mr. Clark initially disappeared. But you're also going to hear today about GPS data, showing that on the night Mr. Clark disappeared, that van drove all the way out to the swamp that dirt came from, and all the way back. Members of the jury, today you're going to hear about a murder that has no body. But today we'll show you that's because the defendant tried to cover it up. But we'll prove she got caught because of that drug, that dirt, and that DNA. And that's why at the end of this trial, we're going to ask you to find her guilty of murder. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. This is Kara Besman. She's dedicated her entire life to taking care of animals. Over a decade ago, Kara met the man she thought she would spend the rest of her life with. They opened a sanctuary. Started rescuing animals. Carol was living the life she'd always dreamed of. But on August 19th of 2017, Kara's dream turned into a nightmare. She woke up that morning in her home and her husband was gone. And the police accused her of killing him. And the prosecution just told you that someone murdered Don Clark. We agree. They told you someone drugged Mr. Clark and dropped his body in the middle of a swamp in the night. And we agree. But where we disagree and what the evidence will not prove is that Carol was the one who did it. Because you're going to learn there was someone else. Someone else who had access to that murder weapon. Someone else with fingerprints in that van. Someone else the FBI never even interviewed. The prosecution didn't tell you about an employee named Kelsey Stebbins. You're going to hear Miss Stebbins was an employee at the Elephant Sanctuary. Miss Stebbins had access to that car, to those boots, and even to the syringe of poison the prosecution just told you was the murder weapon. But I want to make myself clear. It's not our job to prove Miss Stebbins was the one who committed this crime. That burden rests on the prosecution and the prosecution alone to prove Kara's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The highest burden in the American legal system. But that's a burden they'll fail to meet. And we'll show that to you today by asking you to consider 3 questions. First, what evidence does the prosecution actually have? Next, does the prosecution's story even make sense? And finally, could there be another explanation? So let's start with that first question. What evidence does the prosecution actually have? The government will attempt to meet their burden, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, by putting a single witness on the stand today. And that's right, members of the jury. The government will attempt to meet the highest standard in the American legal system by putting a single agent on the stand. You'll learn that agent was the head of an investigation full of mishandled evidence and ignored suspects. You'll hear the only evidence the prosecution has are boots someone else had access to, and the GPS tracker from a car we know someone else could drive. So that brings us to the second question. Does the prosecution story even make sense? They told you Karen Bassett had a motive to kill her husband. She was angry with how that sanctuary was being run. They told you she waited 6 years after they began that sanctuary to kill him. The prosecution told you she was a criminal so skilled she would dump her husband's body in a swamp to make sure it was hidden, but she was careless enough to leave behind a GPS tracker right where the police would find it. Their story isn't reasonable. And that unreasonable story will bring us to that third question. Could there be another explanation? You're going to learn there was someone else, Kelsey Stebbins, an employee at that park who could access everything. Mr. Clark's car, the boots, and the poison used to kill him. For these reasons, at the end of this trial, I'll come back up here and I'll ask that you consider that other explanation. Because there was someone else. And I'll ask that you find Kara not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is up in the upper right hand of your screen, and this will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. Does the government have any witnesses?
Government calls Agent Steph Johnson.
Whenever you're ready.
Could you please state your name for the record?
Hello, everybody. My name is Steph Johnson.
What do you do for a living, sir?
I'm a senior special agent with the FBI. I work out of our Tallahassee field office.
How long have you been with the FBI?
I started my training in 2002, and I've been a senior special agent for about 8 years now.
What sort of work do you specialize in with the FBI?
I've worked over 100 cases, mainly focusing on murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking.
And Agent Johnson, how are you involved in today's case?
I was the lead FBI investigator into the death of Mr. Don Clark. I led the investigation that ultimately led to the arrest of his wife, Kara Bassett.
Now, Agent Johnson, before we get into your investigation, I want to talk a little bit about the people and places involved in this case, okay?
Absolutely.
Who was Don Clark?
Don Clark owned a local elephant park. He was married to Kara Bassett.
When did you first hear about his disappearance?
I first heard about it when the defendant reported his disappearance on August 25th, 2017.
Agent, did the defendant say when her husband had gone missing?
Yes, sir. The defendant reported that the last time she saw her husband was August 18th, 2017, a week earlier.
Did you ask the defendant why she waited a week to report him missing?
Yes, of course. The defendant informed me that she didn't know and that she thought he might be traveling.
So what did you do after that?
Well, next, I got to work trying to track down Mr. Clark, or in the worst case scenario, trying to find his body.
Agent, did you ever look for any bank or credit card records?
Yes, sir. I found the bank and credit card records of Mr. Clark.
What about cell phone records?
Those two, of course.
And what did you learn from those records?
After August 18th, 2017, there was no activity from Mr. Clark's bank records, credit card records, or cell phone.
Now, Agent Johnson, did you look at the defendant's phone records?
Of course, we subpoenaed them.
Did those records show any text messages from the defendant to her husband asking where her husband was during that week?
No, sir.
Any phone calls?
No, sir.
Agent, any text to someone else saying that her husband was missing?
No, sir. None that we found.
Phone calls?
None that we found. We don't have recording of the phone calls, of course.
So then, Agent, what did you do after looking at those records?
After looking at those records, I began to collect physical evidence in this case.
Well, did you search the park that the two of them owned?
Yes, of course.
Agent, are you familiar with what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 18, what's showing on the screen here?
Yes, that is one of these syringes of carfentanil, an elephant tranquilizer, found at the elephant park shared by the defendant and the victim.
And are you familiar with what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 17, an info sheet about that tranquilizer?
Yes, sir.
Agent, what does this sheet say about whether that tranquilizer is fatal for humans?
Oh, it's extremely dangerous and absolutely fatal. The sheet tells us that just 1 milligram of carfentanil, the active ingredient, is lethal for humans. The syringe carried 10 milligrams of carfentanil.
And are you familiar with what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 19, a log from the park about elephant tranquilizer?
Yes, I am.
And Agent, the last line on this log, how many doses does it say were remaining?
It says 24.
How many doses did you find at the park when you searched it?
There were only 23 doses. One was missing.
Did you ask the defendant about that?
Yes, I did.
What'd she say?
She couldn't give me an answer about where the missing dose was.
So, Agent, did you ever look for a body in this case?
Of course. We sent our hounds. We searched far and wide for Mr. Clark's body.
Did you ever find one?
No. Unfortunately, we were not able to recover the body.
Did you find any DNA in this case?
Yes, we did. There was a van that had been driven back and forth to a swamp on the night of Mr. Clark's disappearance. In the back floorboard of that van, we found DNA that matched Mr. Clark, specifically his hair.
And Agent, where did you recover that van?
That was at an airport about 5 miles from the elephant park.
Now, are you familiar with what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 31, some GPS data that car you found?
Yes, I am.
What does this GPS data say that van did on August 18th?
So that van begins at the elephant park. It travels 139 miles to a swamp called the Big Gum Swamp. It stays there for a little while and then travels back to a nearby airport 132 miles away.
Agent, did you ever compare those two routes to see if they were similar?
Yes, they're very similar. The airport is just 5 miles from the elephant park, and both the airport and the elephant park are a little over 130 miles from the Big Gum Swamp in roughly the same direction.
And what times does that data say that Mr. Clark's van was at that swamp?
The van was at the swamp from 1:26 a.m. until 2:10 a.m.
Now, Agent, do you recognize what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 28?
Yes, I do. That's a picture from the Big Gum Swamp.
Did you ever ask the defendant about that swamp?
Yes, of course. I asked the defendant if she had ever been to the swamp.
What'd she say?
The defendant twice denied ever going to the Big Gum Swamp.
Agent, did you ever perform any analysis to see if you could confirm that?
Well, not me personally. I only have a psychology degree. But we have a crime lab back at the field office where we have forensic experts that performs an analysis.
And did they compare any tests from this swamp to anything from the defendant?
Absolutely. We recovered some work boots from the defendant, which had dirt on the bottom. They compared the dirt on the bottom of those work boots to dirt found at the swamp and found that there were two distinct species of algae that matched identically.
So then, Agent, did you ever look for a motive in this case?
Yes, of course.
Are you familiar with what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 15, Mr. Clark's power of attorney document?
Yes, we recovered that in our search for a motive.
What does this document say would happen if Mr. Clark disappeared?
If Mr. Clark disappears, all of his assets are transferred to the defendant.
Agent, were you ever able to put a number on the total value of all these assets?
An obituary showed that the total number was $8 million.
Thank you, Agent. Nothing further.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent Johnson, I'd like to talk about someone else you became familiar with during your investigation.
Absolutely.
Now, you're familiar with someone by the name of Kelsey Stebbins, right?
Yes, Kelsey Stebbins was a park employee.
Right, and you actually never interviewed Ms. Stebbins during your investigation, did you?
Oh, that's not quite right. We interviewed all employees.
Agent, it's your testimony that you questioned Ms. Stebbins?
Yes, we interviewed all employees.
And Mr. Johnson, if you could pull up Exhibit 47. Agent Johnson, do you recognize the person on that screen there?
Yes, that is Kelsey Stebbins.
And Mr. Johnson, if you could go ahead and play that document, that video for us.
Your Honor, excuse me. Before they play the video, we'd actually ask that they offer this into evidence first.
A response, Your Honor?
Please.
We're actually using this under 613B, extrinsic evidence for use of impeachment. It's just demonstrative evidence.
Okay, in that case, it won't be admitted into evidence at this point. Proceed.
Mr. Johnson, if you could go ahead. So, Agent Johnson, if we heard later that that video said Ms. Stebbins was never questioned by the police, that would surprise you, wouldn't it?
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear the audio. All I can tell you is if you look at page 4 of the report I submitted, I told you we interviewed all park employees.
Well, let's go ahead and give that video one more try. Mr. Johnson? Make sure.
I don't get it. I worked with Dawn and Kara every day for 5 years, but the police didn't ask me a single question.
Did you catch it that time, Agent Johnson?
Yes, I could hear it that time.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Now, I'd like to talk about the evidence you found about Ms. Stebbins' access to that sanctuary. Mr. Johnson?
Absolutely.
Now, you'd agree with me, we know that Ms. Stebbins, she had access to the sanctuary, right? She worked there?
Yes, she was an employee.
Mr. Johnson, if you check that box. Now, during your investigation, you actually learned that Ms. Stebbins had access to the syringes kept at that park.
That's true too.
You can check that box off, Mr. Johnson. And finally, you actually found fingerprints of Ms. Stebbins inside Mr. Clark's car, didn't you?
Inside the what? I'm so sorry.
That's right. Inside that car, you actually found fingerprints of Ms. Stebbins, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, that's true. It was the park van.
Mr. Johnson, if you could check that box. I'd like to talk about what evidence you didn't come across when it comes to Kara. Mr. Johnson, if you could pull that up. Now, you didn't find any eyewitnesses claiming it was Kara who committed this crime, right?
There were no eyewitnesses who saw the murder. That's exactly right.
Check that box, Mr. Johnson. Now, you found no DNA evidence indicating that Kara had killed her husband.
That's not quite right.
Well, it's your testimony that you never found any blood, any hair, any DNA belonging to Kara at the crime scene.
That much is true, but we found DNA evidence from the victim in the same van that showed algae residue on the pedals that matched with the algae residue on Kara Bassett's boots.
Right now, Agent, I'm just talking about DNA evidence that belonged to Kara, and you found none of that at that swamp, right?
That's true, yes.
Mr. Johnson, if you could check that box. Now, finally, you found no video evidence of Kara making that drive from the sanctuary to the swamp.
No video evidence, it was just GPS tracking.
Check that box, Mr. Johnson. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Agent. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent Johnson, is Kelsey Stebbins a park employee, or was she at the time?
Yes, sir.
And Agent, did you find any possible motives for any park employees in this case?
No, sir.
Thank you, Agent. Nothing further.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor, no further questions.
Okay, the witness is excused. Anything further from the government at this time?
Nothing from us, Your Honor. We rest our case in chief.
All right. Defense, do you have any witnesses or evidence at this time?
Yes, Your Honor, we call it Joe Kwong.
Whenever you're ready, go ahead and start.
Ms. Kwong, could you go ahead and state your name for the jury?
Hi, I'm Joe Kwong. That's K-U-A-N-G.
Where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from Long Island, New York. Back home, I used to work in my family diner all 4 years of high school.
What brought you down here?
Well, I wanted to stay on Long Island my whole life. But one day, I'm at the diner, bussing tables, and my dad comes up to me and he's like, Joe, you gotta go to college. So I said, okay. I mean, I got really into the application process. I knew I really wanted to go to my reach, Highlands. I really didn't want to end up at my safety, Lowlands. But luckily, I got into my target, Midlands, School of Film here in Jacksonville, and I've been here ever since.
Ms. Kwong, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm actually a big-time TV producer here in Jacksonville.
And how'd you get involved in this case?
Well, I was actually doing this documentary for Kara Bassett. It's called The Elephant Queen.
Let's talk about that documentary. When did you start filming Kara?
Sure, I started back in 2015. It was one of my first gigs. I started taking footage of her elephant park.
I'd like to talk about one specific day. Were you filming Kara on August 18th of 2017?
Yeah, I was. I was at the park that day from 8 to 6. I actually had to leave just then because I was getting on a flight, pre-corona.
Who did you see at the park that day, the employees?
There were a lot of people that day. I mean, Kara was there, Don was there. We got a lot of guests during the summer, so the employees were working.
Do you know of any of those employees by the name of Kelsey Stebbins?
Yeah, I know Kels.
We've heard a little bit today about some syringes used at the sanctuary. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I'm not really involved with the elephants, but I see everything that's there. So I knew about the syringes.
Would you recognize a syringe from that park?
Sure.
Mr. Johnson, if you could put admitted exhibit 18. Now, do you see what's on the screen there, Ms. Kwong?
Yeah, I can see it.
Mr. Johnson, if you could zoom into that image. Ms. Kwong, do you notice anything in particular in that circle area on exhibit 18?
In the little circle?
That's right.
Are you talking about the little thing, the little half circle there?
Yes, inside that blue circle, what do you see on that needle?
It kind of looks like it's a part of the syringe, like a a little circle of it.
Did you ever see the employees using these syringes?
Yeah, I saw the employees using them. They used them all the time.
I'd like to move forward with your time at the sanctuary after August 18th. Did you
Sure.
ever see the police at the sanctuary?
Yeah, I mean, after Dawn went missing, the police came by a lot. I saw them a lot.
Did you ever see them collecting anything, putting anything in evidence bags?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I saw them picking up things. I don't really know if they were doing it right.
What did you see them do?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Do you have a response? Oh. I think we just lost. Can I go ahead and pause for a second? Go ahead when you're ready.
So Ms. Kwong, I'll go ahead and re-ask you that question. Did you see any officers putting any things in any evidence bags?
Yeah, like I said, they came around all the time. They were putting things in bags, but I mean, I don't know if they were doing it exactly right.
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Do you have a response to speculation?
Yes, Your Honor. What I believe Ms. Kwong was about to say is that she wasn't sure they were doing it right because they were handling evidence without gloves. She's not making any expert opinion. She's just stating what she saw at the scene.
Response?
Your Honor, we need to hear that foundation before this witness can talk about the validity of a police investigation and whether or not the police were doing something right. She's not a police officer. She doesn't have any expertise there. We need to hear the foundation first.
A response, Your Honor?
Sure.
What Ms. Kwong actually said was that she didn't know whether they were doing it right. She wasn't putting any sort of value assertion on the investigation.
Overruled. Continue.
Ms. Kwong, what did you see them doing?
Well, sometimes when they were picking up things, they weren't wearing any gloves.
After you saw them picking up things not wearing any gloves, did you notice what they were doing that with?
Well, the police were collecting things and talking to people.
Well, did you see what the police were holding when they weren't wearing any gloves?
I'm pretty sure they were holding a syringe.
Now, you mentioned that the police were talking to some people. Did you ever see them speak to anyone named Kelsey Stebbins?
No, I don't think I saw them talking to Kelsey that week.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. No further questions.
Go ahead with Roth when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Ms. Kwong.
Hi.
And ma'am, I want to start by talking a little about why you're testifying here today, okay?
Sure.
Now, ma'am, the defendant hired you in August of 2015, right?
Yeah, Kara hired me. Like I said, it was one of my first gigs.
And she agreed to pay you $5,000 a month, right?
Pre-tax, of course, yeah.
And $5,000 a month, that's about 60 grand a year, right?
Yeah.
And she paid you that for a little over 3 years, didn't she?
Yeah, just about.
And ma'am, it wasn't just that money. She actually agreed to pay you 20% of any money she was paid for the documentary you made, right?
Oh yeah, if she ever gets around to it.
And isn't it true, Ms. Kwong, a streaming TV service has actually offered $10 million for that documentary?
I know. It's crazy, right? Do you think it's going to happen?
I'm not sure, Ms. Kwong, but $10 million, right?
Yeah.
And then, ma'am, I'd like to talk about what you can and can't tell us about Mr. Clark's disappearance on August 18th, okay?
Okay.
And now, you actually left the country that day, right?
Yeah, I was going out of town.
You left the park at around 6 in the evening.
Yeah, I had a flight to catch.
A flight to Mexico, right?
Flight to Tulum.
And Ms. Kwong, and you didn't return until more than a week later, did you?
Yeah, I was on vacation.
But during your time at the park, Ms. Kwong, you have seen this drug before, Exhibit 18, right?
Yeah, that's the tranquilizers they used.
You actually talked about this on direct, right?
Yeah.
It's an elephant tranquilizer, true?
Yeah.
Ms. Kwong, you've actually seen the defendant using this drug, haven't you?
Yeah. Like I said, all the employees use them.
And the defendant, you've also seen her wearing these boots in Exhibit 29, right?
Yeah, I think I have.
But Ms. Kwong, you're certainly not a forensics expert, are you?
No, I'm a producer.
So, ma'am, you can't tell us where the dirt on the bottom of these boots might have come from, can you?
No.
But you do recognize this van in Exhibit 26, right?
Yeah, of course, that's Don's van.
Ms. Kwong, you don't know when the last time Mr. Clark was inside of this van, do you?
No.
So isn't it true you can't tell the jury when the last time was he might have left DNA behind in his van?
No, I don't know anything about that.
But Ms. Kwong, you can tell us that you've never seen Mr. Clark drive this van to the Big Gum Swamp, right?
I don't know where that is. No.
And then, ma'am, after you got back from Mexico, you did continue making that documentary, right?
Yeah, I did.
That included interviews with the defendant after her husband disappeared, right?
Yeah.
One of those interviews was on Christmas Eve, 2017, wasn't it?
Yeah, I did a lot of interviews.
And Exhibit 44 is a clip from that interview, right?
Yeah.
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 44 in evidence.
Any objection?
Without objection, Your Honor.
Admitted.
Mr. Orr, could you bring up Exhibit 4, please? Exhibit 44. And now, Ms. Kwong, this is the defendant, right?
Yeah, I was, interviewing her, asking her some questions. I did not ask her to have that hairstyle.
That's yes, sir. This is her.
Yeah, it is.
Mr. Orr, could you hit play there for us?
It's Christmas Eve. Don's not here, and I miss him very much. I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Now, Ms. Kwong, the last thing the defendant says in that clip is it's difficult to find the strength to go on, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was just so sad after Don left. And, Kara was just broken up about it.
Well, ma'am, you're saying she was broken up, but isn't it true right here? She's smiling.
Yeah.
And isn't it true, Ms. Kwong, you're familiar with Mr. Clark's obituary, Exhibit 33, aren't you?
Yeah, I read it when it was published.
So you know that obituary says that Mr. Clark was worth about $8 million when he disappeared, right?
That's what it says, yeah.
But Ms. Kwong, the defendant told you her income was only what her husband gave her. True?
Yeah, she mentioned that.
Thank you, Ms. Kwong. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
We have nothing further for this witness, Your Honor.
Okay. Any further witnesses or evidence for the defense at this time?
No, Your Honor, we rest.
Okay, so we will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. And also, since both the witnesses have completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballot now. Is the government ready to proceed with closing arguments?
We are, Your Honor.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Members of the jury, there are some things in this case that everyone can agree on. That drug that was missing from the defendant's home is fatal for humans. That the shoes with the dirt on them belonged to the defendant. And that the DNA found inside of that van belonged to Mr. Clark. But where we disagree, and what this trial really comes down to, is whether any of those facts had anything to do with each other. And today we've proven that they're all connected. That drug is what the defendant used to kill her husband. That dirt is from the swamp where the defendant dumped his body. And that DNA got in the car while the defendant was doing it. Which is why the defendant is guilty of murder. Now, in today's case, we had to prove both that the defendant killed her husband and that she did it on purpose, beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's exactly what we've done today. We've done that by focusing on those three critical pieces of evidence. So then let's go through those, starting with that first one, the drug. Because members of the jury, you heard that this drug was missing from the park. But this was a drug that is 5,000 times more toxic than heroin. This is a drug that you need protective equipment to even handle. This is a drug that can be fatal, even from just inhaling. Members of the jury, a drug like that doesn't go missing by accident. A drug like that only goes missing because a person is committing a crime. Which will bring us to that second thing, the dirt. Because sure, the defendant claimed, I've never been to that swamp before. And that makes sense for her to say, right? Because if she admitted to having been there on that night, well, there's really only one explanation for that. So she said no. But members of the jury, this is why that dirt is so important. Because remember, Special Agent Johnson told you that the dirt found on the defendant's shoes matched the dirt both from the van and from the swamp 100 miles away. Which brings us to that third fact, the DNA. Because it's true, Mr. Clark's hair being in that van alone doesn't prove that he was killed. It was his van, after all. But if that DNA is really just innocuous, then why does the GPS data show that van on the night Mr. Clark disappeared, driving 139 miles to a swamp and then 132 miles back in the middle of the night? Pay very close attention to this, members of the jury. That van was at the swamp from 1:26 to 2:10 a.m. Not p.m., a.m. The van that had the victim's DNA in it drove to a swamp over 100 miles away at 2 in the morning and then was abandoned at 4 in the morning that same day. Members of the jury, it's not rocket science. It's not even geometry. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if this was all just some big coincidence, then why did the defendant not tell anyone her husband was missing until a week after he had disappeared? If she was really devastated, and this is all just some terrible coincidence, then why was this her reaction talking about her husband's disappearance just 4 months after he went away?
I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Members of the jury, the only reason you smile when someone's talking about your missing husband is if you know they're not missing at all. That smile knows her husband is at the bottom of a swamp where no one will ever find him. That smile thinks that she's going to get away with $8 million more. And that smile thinks she's going to get away with it. But the defendant got caught. She got caught because of that drug, that dirt, and that DNA. And that's why we ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's
Just
okay.
one moment.
Whenever you're ready,
Yes.
Permission to proceed.
go ahead.
There was someone else. Today you heard there was someone else who had every opportunity to commit this crime. Someone who had access to that van, access to what the prosecution themselves had called a murder weapon. Someone else who was never even interviewed by the FBI. And because of that, because of the way this case was investigated, we'll never know beyond a reasonable doubt who killed Mr. Blunt. The charge of murder is a serious one. Involving a husband and wife, it can be an emotional one too. In cases like this, it can be hard to separate the facts from our feelings. And that's why we have the law to guide us. The law tells us not to decide a case because we need someone to blame or because we're angry someone didn't do what they should have. These cases are decided on evidence, not emotion. With that need for evidence, a burden rested on the prosecution's table. From the beginning of this trial to the end, you might have had your own ideas about what happened to Mr. Clark. I know I might have. But it was the prosecution's job to prove you wrong, to prove me wrong, to prove that the only reasonable possibility is that Kara killed her husband. But they failed to meet that burden. And we've proven that to you through those three questions I introduced at the beginning of this trial. First, what evidence does the prosecution actually have? Next, does their story even make sense? And third, could there be another explanation? Right now, I'd like to walk through what you learned about each of those questions. First, what evidence does the prosecution have? Today, you learned that there were no eyewitnesses that saw Kara commit this crime. You learned that there was none of Kara's DNA tying her to what might have happened in that swamp. Members of the jury, you heard there was no videotape evidence from a single traffic cam on that 300-mile stretch she would have been driving if she were trying to dump her husband's body. You learned the evidence that the prosecution did have. It was contaminated or compromised. You saw a syringe with a drip at the edge, showing that that evidence wasn't properly being handled. You learned that those agents were handling evidence without using gloves. And we don't know what the evidence would have shown if this investigation had been handled properly. What DNA would have been found on that van? What evidence we would have seen on those boots, or if we might have found that missing syringe. And that brings us to that second question. Does the prosecution's story even make sense? Mr. Peale told you that Kara killed her husband for this payout, that she decided to do it after she'd been living with him for 6 years. They told you that Kara was such a cunning criminal, she was able to hide his body to the point where the FBI couldn't find it, but she decided to keep around the boots she used to move his body. That's not a reasonable story. And that unreasonable story leads us to that third question. Could there be another explanation? As you learned, there was someone else. Kelsey Stebbins, who had access to that car, to those boots, to the sanctuary where Mr. Clark was last seen. Throughout this trial, you've heard that there's no motive Ms. Stebbins committed this crime. Members of the jury, it wasn't our job to prove Ms. Stebbins was the one responsible. It was the prosecution's job to prove it couldn't be a reasonable explanation. And that's not what you've heard. Sometimes it's hard to identify what reasonable doubt is. I want you to think of it like this. In a moment, I'll be done. The judge will send you back to deliberate. When you do, I want you to imagine the bailiff comes into that room with a box. He tells you inside that box is a DVD recording of what happened. A recording telling you who killed Don Clark. Members of the jury, would you need to open that box? Would you need to watch that tape? Because if the answer is yes, that's reasonable doubt. And you know why you need to open that box. Because there was someone else. Find Kara not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, members of the jury, Ms. Greve has been saying all day today that there was someone else. But there wasn't someone else who waited a week before telling anyone her husband was missing. There wasn't someone else who had dirt from that swamp on their boots at their home. And there wasn't someone else who had any kind of motive in this case. No, the only person with $1 million motive here was the defendant. And we know she's guilty because of that drug, that dirt, and that DNA. That's why we ask you to find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Judges, you should go ahead and complete your ballot now and click submit. I'll ask everyone to stay on until everyone has submitted their ballots, and then we'll do some brief comments.